Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at another disturbing case with you. In the age of CCTVs, DNA testing, and constant surveillance, there are very few crimes that can be hidden for long. Today's case is about a monster who was living a horrific double life, a corrupt police force who refused to investigate this case, and a trail of victims who were silenced for years. In the end, all it took to solve this case were a pair of fresh eyes and a discarded pizza box. Keep watching to find out how the Long Island killer was finally caught. Gilgo Beach is on the south side of Long Island, a good hour's drive from the bustling streets of Manhattan. It doesn't look exactly like the type of beach most people have in mind, though. It looks lonely, even abandoned, a place you can bury your secrets in. And hide secrets it did. Over a 15-year period, anywhere from 11 to 18 bodies were found there, hidden away in the underbrush. Since 1996, up to 18 sets of human remains have been discovered along this one isolated beach, spread out over just 3 miles. Heartbreakingly, most of these cases remain unsolved, and many of the victims haven't even been identified. There is a glimmer of hope, though. It looks like at least some of the victims might finally be getting some justice. While the most recent body was found back in 2011, this case really came into the public eye in 2010. That's when people realized the possibility of a Long Island serial killer. Let's go back to where this story all began.
All right, have you been keeping up on this story out of Long Island? It is just, it looks like we have a serial killer. Earlier this month, 4 bodies were found, and in December, 4 other bodies were found all along Long Island. And now ABC has learned that the sister of one of the victims is getting taunting phone calls from someone that may be the killer. The woman's identity is not being released. She was 15 when her sister was killed.
I just don't understand why he chose me. There's how many other girls and how many other families. I don't understand why I was chosen, why I was taunted.
He used prepaid or throwaway cell phones, that he was only on the phone for perhaps up to 3 minutes. At least tells you he's savvy enough that if it's tracked down, it's not going to point to him.
Now I heard that they are thinking that maybe this person could be involved with law enforcement somehow. Police believe the Long Island serial killer could be responsible for up to 12 deaths, even though they have found only 8 bodies.
Attention to these killings started with the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old woman with a complicated past. Shannon, originally from Pennsylvania, had moved to New York with her mother and siblings after her parents split up. Like many young people trying to make ends meet, she worked various odd jobs before eventually turning to sex work. Shannon's life wasn't easy. She'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and had struggled with drug abuse. She'd even survived a violent assault that left her needing a titanium plate in her jaw. So, for Shannon, sex work became a way to pay the bills. But she had hopes for a better future. She was taking online college courses, dreaming of starting fresh somewhere else. On May 1st, 2010, Shannon's life took a turn for the worst. Her driver, a man named Michael Pack, dropped her off at a client's house near Gilgo Beach. The client, Joseph Brewer, had arranged a date with Shannon through Craigslist, but things didn't go as planned. According to reports, Shannon started acting erratically soon after arriving. At about 4:51 a.m., roughly 3 hours after she got there, Shannon made a frantic 911 call. In one of the calls, she said, "They are trying to kill me." In the call, Shannon sounds completely disoriented, like she might be under the influence of something or maybe having some kind of mental health episode. Whatever was going on, it was clear that things had taken a very bad turn. Shannon made a couple more 911 calls after that. She ran out of Brewer's house and started banging on neighbors' doors before vanishing into the night. 2 days later, on May 3rd, Shannon's family filed a missing persons report. The police investigated Joseph Brewer and Michael Pack, even had them take polygraph tests, but neither was ever named as a suspect in Shannon's disappearance. Both men maintained that nothing bad had happened. They claimed Shannon just started behaving strangely and ran off on her own. Months went by with no sign of Shannon. Then in December 2010, something happened that changed the direction the case was taking. A police officer was out training his canine unit in the area where Shannon had last been seen. Suddenly, The dog caught the scent of a human cadaver. They'd found a body, but it wasn't Shannon's. The officer based his choice of search area on FBI data, indicating that dumped bodies are frequently found close to roadways. Despite thick vegetation and a light layer of snow, the cadaver dog alerted to a scent, which the pair tracked to a skeleton wrapped in disintegrating burlap. Over the next few days, more bodies were discovered. The police began a wide-ranging search for clues. They found 4 bodies in total during that initial search, all badly decomposed. This discovery set off a series of searches that would eventually uncover even more remains, including Shannon's, which was finally found in December 2011. Her case was ruled an accidental drowning, though attorneys for her family maintained the autopsy was inconclusive. With so many bodies found in the same place, investigators realized they were dealing with something much bigger than just Shannon's disappearance. The Long Island serial killer case was official. Some of the victims were identified, but others remain unknown to this day.
22-minute 911 call from Shannon Gilbert. The 23-year-old escort was visiting a client in Oak Beach in May 2010 when she called police for help.
What happened?
These people are trying to kill me.
Gilbert went missing after that 911 call. Her remains were found in a nearby marshland more than a year later. The police search for Gilbert led to the discovery of 9 other sets of human remains, the group now known as the Gilgo victims.
4 of the victims, now known as the Gilgo Beach 4, are believed to be connected. These 4 were discovered in December 2010, close together, and their bodies were positioned similarly, bound at the wrists or ankles and covered in burlap sacks. These women were Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, Melissa Barthelemy, 24, Megan Waterman, 22, and Amber Costello, 27. All 4 were sex workers, all had similar looks, and they were all petite. These women ranged from 4'10" to 5'5" in height. And there's another eerie similarity. Each of them had been in contact with someone using a burner phone shortly before they vanished. All 4 were strangled to death, but one of the earliest victims may have been Sandra Castilla. Sandra was a 28-year-old woman from Trinidad and Tobago who was killed in November 1993. Another early killing might be Jessica Taylor. Jessica was 20 years old, and she vanished in July 2003 while working as an escort in Midtown Manhattan. Her mother reported her missing when she didn't show up for a planned get-together in Poughkeepsie. A woman walking her dog in the Manorville woods found some of Taylor's remains that same year. Her head, hands, and forearm were missing. In 2011, 8 years later, Taylor's missing body parts were found along Ocean Parkway just east of Gilgo Beach, on the same side of the road and less than a mile from where the Gilgo 4 were found several months earlier in December 2010. All 5 of the bodies were dumped within 50 feet of the edge of the parkway. The first of the Gilgo 4, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, was from Connecticut, and she worked as an escort on Craigslist. She was last seen in July 2007. Then there's Melissa Barthelemy, a New York native, who went missing in July 2009. Melissa's case also has some dark details. A week after she disappeared, her younger sister Amanda, just a teenager at the time, started receiving awful phone calls. They were threatening and vulgar calls from someone using a burner phone. This person would ask if Amanda was a whore like her sister, and even claimed to have assaulted and murdered Melissa, saying he was watching her body rot. The third identifiable victim, Megan Waterman, was from Maine and also an escort on Craigslist. Megan vanished in June 2010 while staying at a motel not far from Gilgo Beach. And finally, Amber Costello was from a town just 10 miles from Gilgo Beach. She disappeared in 2010 as well. When you look at all these common factors, the similarities between the victims, where they were dumped, even the way some bodies were dismembered, it points to one person being behind all of this. And with some time and persistence, there's no doubt he would be caught. Sadly, this case could potentially have been solved years earlier if the initial investigation had been more thorough. But in order to understand this case fully, we must touch on how ineffective the police response truly was. For years, crucial information and leads weren't followed by anyone. So what slowed down the case? It's exactly what you'd expect: corruption and a level of incompetence. Plus, the fact that the victims were primarily sex workers likely had a role to play in it too. The Suffolk County Police Chief at the time the bodies were discovered was a man named James Burke. This police chief was arrested back in 2015 and later convicted of beating up a suspect who had stolen some rather personal items from his car: cigars, sex toys, and pornography. This wasn't just an isolated incident either. In November 2016, Burke was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison for assault and conspiracy. There was considerable other interagency friction and failures to cooperate in law enforcement that hindered the investigation. Over the years, there was a massive cover-up that ended up with the district attorney in prison, and even the county's top anti-corruption prosecutor getting convicted. It's enough to make you wonder if we should just assume anyone involved in anti-corruption efforts is actually the most corrupt of them all. During those crucial first couple of years, the FBI kept offering to help with the investigation, but Burke and the Suffolk County Police kept turning them down. This behavior should have been a massive red flag. What were they trying to hide? It's a frustrating, infuriating situation. Here we have one of the most notorious serial killer cases in recent memory, and for years it was hampered by the very people who were supposed to be solving it. Over the years, there have been several suspects in the Long Island serial killer case. One of them was named John Betrolf. The Suffolk County prosecutor tried pinning it on him, and it even made sense, since Betrolf had already been convicted of murdering 2 sex workers and was suspected in a third murder. Plus, he lived only 30 miles from Gilgo Beach, where the torsos of Gilgo Beach victims were recovered. Betrolf was a hunter who enjoyed killing animals and a carpenter with access to hacksaws and electric saws, which seemed to fit the profile. Because many of the bodies were found precisely dismembered, his access to and proficiency with these tools is of note.
Anthony Tangretti could barely speak after hearing the wrenching details of his mother's murder when he was a little boy. She was strangled, her skull shattered.
Nothing could be harder for a little boy to lose his mom.
And you thought they would never catch the killer?
Yeah, gave up hope a long time ago.
But now a day he thought would never come. The trial of her accused killer, John Betrolf, a Manorville carpenter, a married father of 2, plucked from an ordinary life when his DNA matched 2 cold murder cases. 30-year-old Rita Tangretti and 20-year-old Colleen McNamee, both prostitutes killed in 1993. For 3 years, Betrolf has maintained his innocence from jail, his family behind him.
He's an excellent family man. That's all I have to say.
Trusting neighbors were stunned.
Always helped everybody. It's just unbelievable. Nobody could believe it.
He's like the mayor of this town. He knows everybody. He helps everybody out.
But prosecutors say DNA in this case is witness to the truth.
It happens. We don't know everything, the dark side of people's lives. But again, we'll present our evidence and we'll leave it up to the jury.
Prosecutors told the jury the case is about science. Both women found naked, uniquely posed in the woods, bodies covered in wood chips, genetic material left on both victims. The case cracked after Betrolf's brother was arrested in an unrelated crime. His DNA a partial match with the killer. Investigators would search the garbage of this Manorville house to find a match in John Betrolf. The defense blasted police for losing evidence, pointing out DNA doesn't prove murder, and others had motives.
The adult daughter of Rita Tangretti, who was murdered by Betrolf, was also the best friend of Melissa, one of the Gilgo Beach victims. Melissa's mother said that her daughter had a lot of calls to Manorville from her phone before her death, but as we now know, that wasn't the case. Even James Burke, the corrupt police chief mentioned earlier, was on the list of suspects at one point. Apparently, he had a history of violence with sex workers. Peter Hackett was another suspect. He was a neighbor of Joseph Brewer who, as you already know, was Shannon Gilbert's client the night she disappeared. Hackett was a former doctor, specializing in biology, which could also make him a suspect. After Shannon disappeared, her mother, who has since passed away, claimed that Hackett called her multiple times, saying he had Shannon and was taking good care of her. When confronted, Hackett denied ever calling Shannon's mother, but phone records told a different story. Oh, and some of Shannon's belongings were found just outside his home. Now, experts put together a psychological profile of the Gilgo Beach Killer. They described him as likely a white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s, educated, with an expensive vehicle, married and employed. Not your stereotypical dysfunctional killer, but someone who seems well-adjusted, at least on the surface. For a long time, the case went cold. But with a new administration and a new chief of police, things finally began to heat up. They decided to focus on those disturbing phone calls, like the ones Melissa's younger sister Amanda received. The new team invested in technology and reconnected with the FBI for assistance. They started tracing all these burner phones, tracking where calls to the victims had been made. Slowly but surely, they narrowed it down to 2 specific areas. The calls were made during the day from Midtown Manhattan, specifically around Madison Square Garden and Penn Station. At night, calls came from Massapequa Park, a residential area in southern Long Island, about a half-hour drive from Gilgo Beach. Interestingly, Massapequa Park is right next to Amityville. Yeah, that Amityville, already associated with horror. These calls weren't just to the victims, but to their relatives, too. The timing of the calls suggested a clear pattern. The killer worked in Midtown Manhattan and lived in Massapequa. You'd think knowing the killer worked in Midtown Manhattan and lived in Massapequa would make things easier. But we're talking about New York here. It's not exactly a small town. The new investigative team started digging through old evidence and finally had a major breakthrough. Let's go back to September 1st, 2010, the day before Amber disappeared. A call was made from a burner phone around Massapequa Park. That same day, a client showed up at Amber's place in West Babylon, New York. Now, Amber and her friend had a little trick up their sleeve. The client would come in, pay Amber up front, and just as things were about to get going, Amber's friend would burst in pretending to be her boyfriend. The client would then be scared off, and they'd keep the money. It's a classic scam, but this time there was a problem. The client later contacted Amber on that burner phone, asking for a rain check. The next day, Amber vanished. Now, someone described this client as an ogre. He was a big white guy, around 250 pounds, 6'4" to 6'6", with huge 70s glasses and dark, bushy hair. Most importantly, he drove a Chevrolet Avalanche. And this detail about the Avalanche had been sitting in those files for over a decade. So the police started looking for Chevrolet Avalanches and the names linked to them. One name that popped up was Rex Heuermann. He was 59, which put him in his 40s when the crimes occurred. Interestingly, his name had never come up before March 2022. They dug deeper. Heuermann was a wealthy architect who founded Heuermann Consultants and Associates, Inc. in Midtown Manhattan back in 1994. He had worked with big names like Nike, American Airlines, Target, and so on, and he lived in Massapequa Park, just across the bay from Gilgo Beach. Rex Heuermann had a wife and 2 grown children, a daughter in her 20s and a stepson in his early 30s. He ticked pretty much every box on the original profile of the serial killer. When they looked into his online activity, things got dark. He had fake email addresses, Tinder accounts, and some seriously disturbing internet searches. You can use your imagination. It was the worst stuff you can think of. That's what he was looking up. Fortunately, here's where modern technology really shines. Back when the investigation first started, they'd found hairs on some of the bodies, burlap sacks and duct tape used to bind the victims. But in 2010, they couldn't get much information from them. But now technology has made it possible. The investigators went through Heuermann's trash, including pizza boxes he'd thrown out at work. DNA testing showed a definite match between Heuermann's DNA and one of his victims. A potential match to Heuermann's wife was also found when comparing hair found on or near 3 of the victims to samples taken from bottles found in the trash outside the Heuermann residence. Investigators have stated that Heuermann's wife and children were out of state each time the killings are believed to have occurred. Finally, On July 13, 2023, Hoyerman was arrested as he left his office that evening. After 13 long years, investigators are confident they've got their guy. It seems that Hoyerman probably knew the authorities were closing in on him. In the 16 months leading up to his arrest in July 2023, he conducted over 200 internet searches about the Gilgo Beach Killer and the Long Island Serial Killer. Hoyerman had apparently even resumed visiting escorts and, most worryingly, had been trying to track down one of his alleged victims' children. But this is where Hoyerman slipped up. He was uploading selfies from his burner phone. If you're trying to stay anonymous, that's not exactly a smart move. These selfies were intended for sex workers. He was also caught on CCTV in stores, buying more minutes for his burner phone. He'd used the name Andy Roberts for this phone, as well as for Tinder accounts and email addresses. The investigators were able to track down where the phones were used, both the burner phones and his personal phone. These two phones would travel together, which is how they were able to definitively make a connection between them.
In December 2010, the remains of 10 people were found near Ocean Parkway in Suffolk County, New York. Nearly 13 years later on Thursday night, 59-year-old Rex Heuermann was arrested in Manhattan and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree murder. That includes the death of Buffalo native Melissa Barthelemy. She went missing in July 2009. At the time, she was working as an escort, a trend the district attorney says is consistent in the case.
They all did the same thing for a living. They all advertised the same way. And there were immediately similarities with regard to the crime scenes.
According to police, the women, including Barthelemy, were tied up and covered with camouflaged burlap sacks. Male hair was found in one of the burlap sacks, according to the bail application in the case.
For each of the murders, he got an individual burner phone, and he used that to communicate with the victims. Then shortly after the death of the victims, he then would get rid of the burner phone.
In March of last year, 6 weeks after a task force was formed on the case, law enforcement identified Heuermann as a suspect.
We had him under surveillance. We had other means of monitoring him.
And continued to keep an eye on what he was doing over the course of the next year.
We were able to use fictitious or fraudulent email addresses and get Google warrants, and from there, we got his searches.
Those warrants turned up evidence that Heuermann allegedly searched for information about the Gilgo Beach murders over 200 times. Heuermann had little to say in court Friday afternoon.
We are going to hold him responsible for what he did in this case.
Lynn Barthelemy spoke to Claudine Ewing in 2011, shortly after Melissa's remains were found. After Heuermann's arrest, Lynn simply told Two on Your Side, "I'm just relieved." According to court documents, investigators were able to link Heuermann to the crime scene discovered in 2010 from a pizza box he threw out in January of this year. Lab technicians were able to match his DNA from pizza crust to the hair found in the burlap sack.
Hoyerman has pleaded not guilty to all charges. He's been charged with first and second-degree murder of Megan, Amber, Melissa, and Maureen. As for his earliest victim, Sandra, Hoyerman was 29 and 3 years away from getting his architecture license when her remains were found. DNA from hairs found on her body matched Hoyerman, so he's recently been charged with her killing as well. Hoyerman was also charged with second-degree murder in the killing of 20-year-old Jessica Taylor. He's suspected of killing a 7th woman, Valerie Mack, but no charges have been filed in that case. Suffolk District Attorney Raymond Tierney said during a press conference, his intent was to locate these victims, hunt them down, bring them under his control, and kill them. His attorney has pointed out that the case is largely circumstantial at this point. Hoyerman reportedly told his lawyer in tears, "I didn't do this."
The only thing I can tell you that he did say as he was in tears was, "I didn't do this."
The attorney emphasized that everyone is presumed innocent until proven guilty in our country, and they're looking forward to fighting this case in a court of law, not in the court of public opinion. You'd think a wealthy architect working in Midtown Manhattan would be living large, but in Hoyerman's case, you'd be wrong. Hoyerman's house, despite his profession as an architect, was described as the neighborhood eyesore. It is actually his childhood home, which he purchased from his mother in 1994. In an interview on YouTube, Hoyerman stated he has worked in Manhattan since 1987. He spoke about renovating it, but let it fall into further disrepair. According to the arrest affidavit, when Heuermann allegedly killed the 3 victims he's been charged with, his wife was conveniently out of town. This led police to believe that after contacting the victims on Craigslist via burner phones, he likely brought them back to his house, killed them there, and then dumped their bodies at nearby Gilgo Beach. Neighbors considered Heuermann creepy. One even said, "I wasn't surprised at all" when asked about the allegations, citing his general creepiness. Another neighbor would complain that Heuermann would frequently peer over their yard and try to talk to his wife while he was away at work. His was the house parents warned their kids to avoid on Halloween. The police search of Heuermann's home turned up some truly bizarre items. There were about 300 guns. He only had licenses for less than half. A creepy child's doll encased in glass, and a portrait of a disfigured woman. There's also his unnerving wig. Unsurprisingly, his wife has since filed for divorce. Interestingly, accounts of Heuermann from his coworkers are mixed. Some describe him as nice and sociable, while others found him creepy and unsettling. Heuermann's 2 adult children had said through an attorney that they stand by their father. He had this habit of bringing up the Gilgo murders out of the blue, which in hindsight seems pretty suspicious. Heuermann was also very litigious. Over the past decade, he filed at least 4 personal injury lawsuits against drivers, seeking a total of about $20 million. The defendants claimed he exaggerated or even staged his injuries. On top of that, he's years behind on hundreds of thousands in taxes. He was once kicked out of a Whole Foods for stealing fruit. They were clementines left out for kids to snack on. After a 12-day search of Heuermann's home, investigators found a soundproof vault in his basement. But thankfully no bodies or bones, at least not yet. But that's also where they found a hard drive. They had to make the data on it accessible after Heuermann allegedly tried to delete it. And once they did, they discovered a document to plan out kills. The all-caps document, which prosecutors described as Heuermann's blueprint for murder, was allegedly written between 2000 and 2002. It reads like a grocery list with disturbing tasks to complete before, during, and after killings. Written in capital letters, the manual is structured as a series of reminder lists under topics like pre-prep, which offers banal tips about the importance of checking weather reports and looking for surveillance cameras. The prep section is more grim, with directives to set up a holding area and stage with equipment for apparent sexual torture. The body prep list includes reminders on how to avoid leaving evidence. One note reads, "More sleep and noise control equals more playtime." Under the heading, "Things to Remember," it reads, "Get sleep before hunt," and consider a hit to the face or neck next time. A body prep checklist includes a note to remove ID marks, like tattoos, and remove head and hands. Another section lists potential problems, citing things like DNA, tire marks, fingerprints, possible witnesses, and hair. The manual's instructions on packaging bodies for transport corresponded to the condition of the Gilgo 4 when they were found near Ocean Parkway. The instructions also match the handling of the bodies of the 2 women that Heuermann was charged with killing. The manual, assembled with an architect's precision, suggests that Heuermann engaged in sadistic sexual acts with his victims before and after death. Heuermann maintained a double life, waiting for his wife and their children to leave on vacation, and then possibly detaining, torturing, and killing his victims in the basement of the family home in Massapequa Park, a middle-class neighborhood dense with well-kept houses. The manual includes a reminder to destroy computer files, and Heuermann had taken steps to delete it, but forensics experts were able to recover it. Mr. Heuermann's personality, according to a criminologist and expert on serial killers, it's totally consistent with his personality type. He's a highly meticulous, organized, intelligent individual who didn't leave one detail unattended to. According to a retired NYPD sergeant, before all this is over, he could become one of the most prolific serial killers ever on Long Island. There may be as many as 50 more unsolved murder cases that could be linked to him based on this time frame and his MO. Are there more killers out there? Or is Heuermann responsible for even more of these deaths? Do you think police negligence led to further killings? We would love to know what you think about this developing case. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more videos like this, please be sure to like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more true crime videos. See you in the next one.